Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Welcome to Online Lecture 2C here in your Biology 140 semester. Here in Online Lecture 2C, we will be in the Chapter 3 PowerPoint. Again, Chapter 3, looking at slides 23 and 24, just to kind of review that. I know we covered some of that in class. And then we'll go from that slide 24 through all the way out to about, say, we'll probably get the hydrologic cycle, so probably end around slide 39 or so. We'll just kind of see how things go, but that's kind of the goal here. Also, I have two videos for you all to watch. One video is on the food chain or the food pyramid. Some also might refer to it as a food web, and then we'll also look at a little video on the hydrologic cycle. So let's start off here in slide 23 without any further delays, and let's just recap photosynthesis briefly here. Here on this slide entitled Photosynthesis, you can see we have covered quite a bit of this already, but I wanted to just emphasize a few things. So what do you really need to know about photosynthesis? Well, first of all, photosynthesis is the process where we are taking the sunlight, and if you all recall, sunlight is the main form of energy that enters a system, our ecosystem in particular. And so the sunlight comes in, it's absorbed by plants. Only 1 to 2% of the sun's energy is actually used to perform photosynthesis. Again, 1 to 2% of the light that strikes the plant. And y'all remember, it's visible light that powers photosynthesis. And so solar energy, I'm circling that here for you, is going to combine with 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters with lots of enzymes and all types of cellular machinery found in the chloroplast. And then we're going to, with all that enzyme activity and chemical reactions, and with the chloroplast doing its amazing work, you get glucose, C6H12O6, and glucose is sugar. It's a simple monosaccharide, a carbohydrate, and of course we'll produce 6 oxygens as well. And so that summarizes what's happening in photosynthesis. All the stuff on the left side of the arrow, guys, that's called the reactants, and everything on the right side of the equation are called the products. Products are which are produced in photosynthesis. Again, so what do we do then with this glucose sugar? Well, this glucose sugar, the C6H12O6, has lots of energy stored in its chemical bonds. You see, folks, we've taken the solar energy, the energy from the sun, and that energy is now locked up within the bonds of the C6H12O6 glucose molecule. So it then serves as the primary fuel for all metabolic processes. It can be used to make all other organic compounds. So glucose is a precursor to making proteins. It also can be used to make other carbohydrates, and it can be used to make lipids. It's going to fuel cellular movement, transport of ions across membranes. All cellular work is going to then come from the energy from that glucose molecule. Isn't that amazing? And just to give you an idea of where things happen, let's go on to slide 24. And you can see here in this slide the light energy coming in, striking the chloroplasts. And within the chloroplast we have chlorophyll, which makes the chloroplast green, which actually makes the whole plant green, at least the parts that have the chlorophyll. And you have these light-dependent reactions occur, where the light energy is converted into high-energy molecules. Those high-energy molecules are ATP, which they didn't put that out there for you, but I'm going to write it in for you. And the other one is called NADPH. So we're going to make these two molecules, these high-energy molecules, from the light reactions. And then those high-energy molecules, ATP and NADPH, are going to be used to give their energy to carbon dioxide through reduction and oxidation. And then the CO2 is essentially going to be reduced. The carbon dioxide is going to receive electrons and hydrogens to become carbohydrates. Again, typically it's C6H12O6 glucose. And that second step where the CO2 becomes the glucose is called the light-independent reactions. And of course, the oxygen is produced back here in the light-dependent reactions. So that's a nice summary of what's happening. You could even see the water molecule coming in here, and then it is split, and that's what makes our oxygen, and the hydrogen's used to do other things which we won't get into. But that's a nice sort of big summary here in photosynthesis. Now, what about organisms that don't perform photosynthesis? What do they perform to get their energy? Well, we perform cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is the opposite, folks, of photosynthesis. Think about that. Look at this equation here at the bottom of the screen. C6H12O6, the glucose, plus 6 oxygens. Now, were those reactants in photosynthesis? Anybody remember? No, guys, these were the products. But in cellular respiration, C6H12O6 and 6O2 are the reactants on the left side of the equation. And then on the right side of the equation, we have our 6 waters, our 6 carbon dioxides, and our energy. The energy actually comes out as a product. So in cellular respiration, we're taking the chemical bonds and the energy locked up in those chemical bonds within the glucose, using oxygen, and with lots of enzymes and chemical reactions in the mitochondria, not the chloroplast, but in the mitochondria, we break it up into water, CO2, and we get a whole bunch of energy. And folks, it's this chemical reaction that's giving you all the energy that you've ever lived on, or almost all the energy you've lived on, most of it anyway. So photosynthesis captures energy, cellular respiration releases it. Okay, so in photosynthesis, we're packaging the energy, and cellular respiration, we're opening up the present. So cellular respiration splits the carbon and hydrogen atoms from the sugar, recombines them with oxygen to produce CO2 as a waste gas and water. So as we perform cellular respiration, we are producing CO2. That's why you're exhaling and getting rid of it. And water is also coming out as you exhale, and a lot of that water was produced in cellular respiration. Again, it is the opposite of photosynthesis. And this is how all animals get all their energy. Let's go ahead and throw in fungi too. So this is how all animals and fungi get their energy. And so you can see how dependent we are on plants, because plants perform photosynthesis, and they give us the C6H12O6 and the O2 that we need, and we in turn give the plants CO2, which they need, and even a little bit of water. They could certainly use the water that we produce from cellular respiration. You see, folks? So we're very much interdependent on each other. Here is the big picture summary. So now we can kind of bring it all together, and we can say, all right, here's your photosynthesis in your plants. There's the oxygen being produced. We make the sugars. The producers, like the rabbit, consume the sugars and breathe in the oxygen. And then the movement and membrane transport is performed by these animals and fungi. And then heat is going to, of course, come out. We lose a lot to heat. If y'all remember, there's energy transformations that are occurring in this rabbit's body as it eats the sugar and does its digestion, and so we lose a lot to heat. Then water is going to be coming out, and CO2 is coming out from the rabbit and the fungi and the earthworm. And then CO2 is coming in, and the water is coming from these consumers and decomposers and then going to the plants. And then the plants, using sunlight, go back into the cycle again, producing oxygen and sugars. And so there's this wonderful circle of life. Oh, yes. In fact, we're going to be looking at a video shortly here on that circle in just a little bit. All right, so now that we've kind of covered some information on energy, and we have talked about cellular respiration and thermodynamics and photosynthesis, we can now begin to start talking about ecology and species and populations. So now let's look at the big picture, species to ecosystems, and again, keeping in mind all the things that we've just talked about, you know, like the cycle of life that we just covered. Ecology. This is a very big part of this course. In fact, I'd say, you know, almost half of environmental biology is ecology. The scientific study of relationships between organisms and their environment. So we're going to look at relationships between organisms. Like we're going to look at predator-prey relationships, like, bobcats attacking rabbits and eating them, and rabbits avoiding bobcats. All right, so we'll do that kind of thing. But they'll also look at how rabbits and bobcats interact with their environment. Like we'll look at the effect of soil types on how that affects rabbit populations. We might look at the amount of rainfall and how that might affect the rabbit population, which then in turn affects the bobcat population. So we're looking at relationships between organisms and their environment. Within the study of ecology, we study species, where we look at organisms of the same kind, like, for example, bobcats. They are all genetically similar enough to breed in nature and produce live, fertile offspring. That's the key to a species. In most cases, this definition works, that the species would be organisms of the same kind that can mate and produce viable, fertile offspring. Okay? So, for example, a wolf and a coyote, despite them being designated as different species, they can mate and produce viable offspring. You can get coyote-wolf hybrids, although that typically doesn't happen in nature because they actually hate each other. But it can happen, especially if you have a female coyote in heat and there's a male wolf around. He might just go ahead and mate her, especially since he's bigger and more powerful. And so that would be, though they are designated as a different species, according to this definition, wolves and coyotes are the same species. Now, that definition of species doesn't work for all organisms. For example, what do you say about microbes, like archaeans and bacteria? Well, how do you use that definition? Mating and producing viable offspring? Well, they don't even mate. They don't even breed. Sometimes they just split into two through this process called binary fission. So the definition of species here that we have does not work for all, but it works well for organisms like animals and many plants and fungi. A population. Well, the population is a word to describe all the members of a single species. How about we throw that in there? Living in a given area at the same time. So an example of a population would be the population of white-tailed deer in Burt County, or the population of bluegills in the western Piedmont pond. Members of a species living in a given area at the same time that have the potential to mate with each other. That's part of the idea of the population. So population is only one species, folks, living in that area, and of course there will be matings between the members of the population. And when we study ecosystems, we often look at the species and population level, and then there are other levels beyond that, though. So we are going to go ahead and go beyond those and look at now biological communities. All of the populations living and interacting in a particular area. So to go beyond population to community, we just have to start including all of the populations, or more than one population. For example, if we are looking at the bluegill and catfish populations in the western Piedmont Pond together, then now we're looking at a community. If we're looking at every population within the western Piedmont Pond, including all the fish species in that pond, like largemouth bass, now we're beginning to look at the community. Or on the terrestrial environment, we'd be looking at white-tailed deer, coyotes, even, say, oak trees in Burt County. Now we're looking at the biological community. All of the populations, or two or more populations, is oftentimes, we also use the word community for even describing just two or three populations in one area. So, can we go above community? Yes, we can go even beyond that. So we are going to do that. Let's go on to the next level in the hierarchy of life. So the next level is the ecosystem. So this is the biological community. So this would be the populations in the area plus the physical environment. So the ecosystem even includes the non-living component of the environment we live in. So this includes the physical environment. which again, things like the climate, water, minerals, sunlight, soil, that is your physical environment. And so when you're including the community and then you throw in water and minerals and soil and sunlight, now you're beginning to look at the whole ecosystem. And that's what we're doing in ecology. We're looking at the physical environment and the living component. It is difficult sometimes to define the boundaries of an ecosystem. If it's an aquarium, if you have a fish aquarium at home, folks, that is very easy. That boundary is clear, it's obvious. But in the natural world, ecosystems are open and that they exchange materials and energy with the surroundings, and other organisms can come and go. You know, you might have a migration where you have a population of zebra move into the ecosystem and then move out, and they will exchange materials. As they eat materials in that area, they'll pick those up and then take them out. Or they might bring in materials in the form of fecal matter. They might bring that in. So it's very difficult to define clearly where the ecosystem starts and ends. Sometimes it's easier, like in the spruce fir forest, the high elevations around here. Well, that's pretty easy to see because you can actually see a very distinct line of green spruce and fir trees this time of year. You can see where the green meets the brown of the deciduous forest below. Sometimes it's clear, but a lot of times it's hard to really know where it starts and where it ends. Okay? So the boundaries sometimes are defined by the scientists studying the area. Okay? Let's now move on to food chains and food webs, and this is where I would like you all to see a video actually. So let's go ahead and look at this little video clip on food chains and food webs just to kind of prepare you for what we're about to cover.
An ecosystem is a community of living and non-living things that work together. If there isn't enough light or water or food and something in that system dies, all the plants or animals that depend on them will die. All the parts work together to make a balanced system.
Everything you see exists together in a delicate balance. As king, you need to understand that balance and respect all the creatures, from the crawling ant to the leaping antelope.
Dad, don't we eat the antelope?
Yes, Simba, but let me explain. When we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass. So, we are all connected in a great circle of life.
Producers are typically plants or algae. They pull nutrients from the soil or the ocean and manufacture their own food using photosynthesis. Consumers are animals which cannot manufacture their own food and need to consume other organisms. There are three types of consumers: herbivores, animals that only eat plants; omnivores, animals that eat plants and other animals; and carnivores, animals that only eat meat. Trophic levels that make up consumers are primary consumers, which are herbivores; secondary consumers, which are carnivores that eat the herbivores; and tertiary consumers, which are carnivores that eat other carnivores. Decomposers break down dead plant and animal material and waste and release it again as energy and nutrients into the ecosystem for recycling. In all ecosystems, the primary producers get their energy from the sun. That energy then flows through the food chains and webs from producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers and then to tertiary consumers. At all levels there is decomposition, and those nutrients are then recycled and the cycle begins again. Plants make oxygen and energy in the form of glucose, which we then consume when we eat plants or animals that have eaten those plants. Changes in predator or prey population can have drastic cascading effects on the equilibrium of many other populations in the ecosystem. For example, if hunters decrease the deer population, then animals that feed on the deer like coyotes, wolves, wildcats, or bear will also decrease their populations because they are lacking a food source. Trophic levels are not always simple integers because organisms often feed at more than one trophic level. For example, some carnivores also eat plants, and some plants are carnivores. The feeding habits of a juvenile animal and consequently its trophic level can change as it grows up. A food web is a diagram showing the various different plants and animals in an ecosystem in relation to each other. It encompasses many consumers of each different level, acknowledging that one predator may eat several different kinds of prey, and that one kind of prey may be eaten by several kinds of predators. There are many food chains within a food web, and one creature is not necessarily at the top of the hierarchy. As energy passes to a higher trophic level, approximately 90% of the useful energy is lost. High trophic levels contain less energy and fewer organisms than lower levels.
Okay, folks, pretty interesting little video there, and I liked a lot of the, the diagrams. Heck, the music was pretty nice, wasn't it? And didn't you like the way, what's that, Mukaha, whatever his name is, Simba's dad, right? Got to hear him explain the food chain, the food web there in the African savannah. Pretty cool. So anyway, let's go ahead and look and see what we've got here. A lot of stuff is going to be, concepts that were kind of introduced there in that video. So food chains and food webs, let's kind of get into a little bit about what this is. So, in a food chain and a food web, as you saw in the video, a food chain is more linear. So you go from like a plant to the grasshopper, to the mouse, to the fox, etc., whatever. That's just a one sort of line, but really in the real world, food webs are more accurate. Food webs show all the different prey items that the organism might be consuming, and also includes a lot of the decomposition process in there. So food webs are more accurate than food chains. But in either case, photosynthesis is at the base of all ecosystems. So the plants are also called the producers. So they're the ones that are actually tapping into that sunlight energy, harnessing it, and then passing that energy on to all the others. So they're at the base. And in the aquatic ecosystem, that's going to be performed mainly by algae. But here on the terrestrial world, it's plants. Productivity in the ecosystem and through food chains and food webs is just simply the amount of biomass produced in a given area during a given period of time. So for example, if I have a 1 acre forest, the biomass produced in that 1 acre forest might be 400 kilograms in 1 year. So if we produce 400 kilograms of living material, or what is produced by the living world in that 1 acre forest is 400 kilograms, that is the biomass. In a grassland, a 1 acre grassland, maybe in 1 year you might produce, 50 kilograms of grass in 1 acre in 1 year. That would be your productivity. Photosynthesis is described as primary productivity because it's the very basis for all the other growth in the ecosystem. It's the first growth. In fact, it's not only the basis, but it's the first. So the first things that are going to grow in an ecosystem are your plants, your algae, and then all the others will then begin to feed on those plants and algae, and then they'll eventually grow too. Then after that, we have what's called secondary productivity, where we have manufactured biomass by organisms that eat the plants. So again, these will be the herbivores. Herbivores are involved in secondary productivity. So if a deer gains 2 kilograms of mass in the month of July, that it would be secondary productivity, that the deer put on 2 pounds of, say, muscle. So we have primary productivity, that might be 100 kilograms of, say, grass in a field, which translates into, say, 10 kilograms of deer muscle. Okay? So primary, secondary productivity, and you guessed it, there's going to be even more than that. You can go on up the chain. As you can see here on the next slide here, we have the food chain. Again, this is a linked feeding series. It's very linear, very two-dimensional. However, what's really typically happening in nature is a web, an interconnected food chain with many chains represented all at the same time, as most consumers have multiple food sources, right? Like a black bear. I mean, do black bears just eat meat? Of course not. They actually eat more fruits from nature and roots and things like that than they do meat items. They'll eat both. And so a black bear may eat grubs. They may even eat some ants, and they might eat some roots and some berries and even a rabbit, all in one day. Your trophic levels, again, this is the organism's feeding status in the food web. So again, we've had the producers, we've already talked about those, the plants, and then the animals that eat the plants are called the herbivores or primary consumers, and then the secondary consumers are those that eat the herbivores, and then tertiary consumers, which could even eat other carnivores, and they might even eat herbivores too. They could eat both actually, but they're sort of at the top, like the hawk. Omnivores are typically secondary consumers, but you could even have an omnivore that's a tertiary consumer. For example, a bear could eat a snake and also then eat some plant matter on the same day. So the bear could act as a tertiary consumer and a secondary consumer all on the same day. Organisms that recycle dead bodies and remove waste are scavengers or detritivores and decomposers. A scavenger, a detritivore, is something that's going to be eating like a dead, say, a deer carcass, or something that was hit on the side of the road, like a dead possum. Those are your scavengers. A crayfish eating dead fish flesh. Okay, that would be a scavenger or a detritivore. Whereas a decomposer is typically breaking down very tiny dead particles. Like decomposers, guys, are usually bacteria and fungi, breaking down very tiny, almost microscopic pieces of dead flesh. Okay, so the scavengers, the detritivores, initially take the carcass and break it down, and eventually the decomposers will begin to break down that body. Sometimes scavengers and detritivores are consuming, like a vulture might be consuming a dead gazelle, and at the same time decomposers could also be rotting the gazelle's flesh at the same time. Okay, so all those different levels are your trophic levels. And this is a nice picture of a food web, notice. So we have the rabbit consuming the fungi and some of the plants, lichens in the area. It looks like it's eating a lot of lichens in this ecosystem. And then you have the caribou or the reindeer eating these plants over here. And the wolf is also consuming some of that as well. The beaver is eating the plants. And then, of course, well, actually, the way the arrow is shown is if the arrow is pointing towards the animal, that means the animal is eating that prey item. Like the beaver is not eating the wolf. I shouldn't say that. The wolf, of course, is eating the beaver. So that arrow shows that the biomass from the beaver is going into the wolf. All right, and then the biomass of the wolf is going to the plant. Does that mean the plant's eating the wolf? Well, yeah, when the wolf decomposes, when its flesh is broken down to small particles like carbon, then that carbon is taken up by the plant. And nitrogen from the wolf is taken up by the plant. So in a sense, the plant is sort of eating the wolf, right? Not directly, obviously, but it's absorbing its nutrients. And so this is a complex food web. Of course, the man here at the top is consuming the caribou, but some of the man's body flesh is going to wind up in the plants too. Okay, so that's a food web, and that's a very simple one. Trophic levels, let's get into that a little bit. So we mentioned the trophic levels, kind of where your status is in the ecosystem. And so again, you can see the breakdown here in a nice, neat table. So you can identify organisms by the type of food they consume. Again, we have gone through all these. The only thing I just mentioned a whole lot of is omnivores. Again, they eat both plants and meat like bears, raccoons, pigs. Humans, we're also omnivores. Okay? All right, so we covered that. Let's see if we can get to some of the more detailed information here in just a second about how the energy flows. This picture shows you the flow of energy from the sun to the producers, and then on up to the herbivores, to the carnivores, and to the top carnivores. And you can see that as you go from one level to the next, it doesn't really indicate it, but producers are the most abundant. So guys, this is the base of the pyramid. So this would be, very large. There's very, if this is a pyramid, producers would be this huge base. And then the primary consumers, the herbivores, would be much smaller. And then the secondary consumers population is even smaller. And then the tertiary consumers are even smaller. So you ever notice that? Like, think about when you go in the woods, what are you guaranteed to see in the woods? Trees, right? Those are your producers, right? And then what are you probably going to also see? You're probably going to see some herbivores. You're probably going to see squirrels, or you might even see a deer. Certainly see some birds that are also herbivores. So you have a good chance of seeing herbivores. But are you likely to bump into a carnivore when you're taking a walk in the woods? Not as likely, right? You're not as likely to bump into a bobcat or a coyote or even a bear. It's not as likely. There's not as many of them. And a lot of them, of course, are also nocturnal. And seeing a bird of prey, it's kind of an exciting thing. So as you go up the chain, the population drops. Why is that? You might wonder, why do we have so many producers and lots of herbivores, but we don't have as many carnivores? It doesn't even matter which ecosystem you're talking about. Well, we'll see in just a minute that a lot of the energy is lost as you go up each trophic level. We'll get into that in a minute. This is a much more complicated food web showing the full scope, or a much larger scope, of what's really happening out there. And as you can see, it's very complicated. Like, for example, if you look at the warthog, just the warthog here, you could see it's eating grass, but it's also being eaten by a lot of other things, like the lion, like potentially the cheetah. It even shows here the mouse maybe eating a piece of it once it dies. So that's a very complicated interaction. But you can see you have your primary producers, your autotrophs at the bottom. You can see you have your herbivores. Then you have your secondary consumers, your carnivores, and then your top carnivores at the top, like the hyena. Our food web is actually not as complicated. We don't have as many large predators in this area. Part of it's because of habitat destruction. A lot of it is because of that. And part of it's because we're in a different biome. This is the savanna, which has a very large number of large mammals, partly because there's so much grass for the herbivores. So you have such a good herbivore base. You have such a good producer base. You can support large predators, whereas in a temperate deciduous forest, we don't have as much available edible vegetation. And even though we have a lot of trees, a lot of those leaves aren't especially nutritious. Grasses are actually more nutritious and productive for herbivores. So we won't ever quite have the number of large predators that, say, Africa has. Even when North Carolina was relatively untouched, we still did not have the large predator diversity as what we see in the African savanna. Okay, so when you're looking at your pyramids and your food webs, we have this little thing called the 10% rule. Basically, organisms at various trophic levels of food chain or food pyramid, arranged diagrammatically, they form this pyramid, again, with more producers than consumers. They form the broadest base of the pyramid, as I sort of sketched out just a second ago. Why is that? Again, the second law of thermodynamics has a lot to do with this. Remember, that law says that energy is lost at each level of the pyramid. So every time there's an energy transformation, and every time one organism is consuming another, we lose a lot of energy in the form of heat mainly. So energy is lost as heat in these metabolic processes. And so we have this thing called the 10% rule. It's a rough number, guys. It's not exactly 10%, but we can use that as an idea of what's happening. So this is the energy or biomass transfer. So for example, if I had 100 kilograms of clover, that will translate into 10 kilograms of rabbit flesh, which will then translate into 1 kilogram of fox flesh. And then if something ate the fox, can anybody tell me what that would translate into? 1 kilograms of fox flesh would translate into 0.1 kilograms of, say, coyote flesh or whatever ate the fox. You see? So the 10% rule can be used, and on the test, you do need to be able to apply the 10% rule. So if I said we had, 50 kilograms of, let's say, bluegrass, or little blue stem. It's a type of grass. So I have 50 kilograms of little blue stem, and then we have buffalo eat the blue stem. How many kilograms of buffalo flesh would result from 50 kilograms of little blue stem plant consumption? Yeah, it'd be about 5 kilograms, right? And then if a wolf ate the buffalo, how much would that be? Yeah, that would translate into 0.5 kilograms of wolf flesh. You see? So as you go up the pyramid, again, you have less and less biomass. And again, that also explains why we don't have as many carnivores compared to, say, herbivores or producers, certainly. Okay? All right, and so this is the last little slide here. Well, actually, almost the last slide. I'll get a little bit into the water cycle. But this just shows you, again, energy loss within the food chain. So there's your producers with the most energy. Then they pass on 10% of their biomass to the herbivore. 10% of that then goes to carnivores. And you could see a lot of it's going to be lost through respiration. A lot of it's going to be lost through metabolic processes, etc. And a lot of it's just simply going to pass through the animal's body. Like a lot of plant matter goes undigested in herbivores especially. So, just see, their little pellets that a lot of the herbivores make. You see a lot of undigested food. Again, this is showing you the actual numbers now, population numbers. So we have 1.5 million producers in this particular ecosystem in the summertime. That translates to 200,000 herbivores, including, things like caterpillars and mice. And then that translates into 90,000 primary carnivores, and that then boils down to only one top carnivore or one species. So yeah, you don't expect to go out in the woods and just bump into a bunch of carnivores. You might get lucky, every once in a while. They might be all gathered around a carcass or something, but you're not likely to see a whole lot of them in any ecosystem. So that's why it's a big deal if you do get to see a wolf in the wild, or a big grizzly bear, even a black bear. It's pretty exciting to see one. There's only about, just to give you all a number, we have about, in the most healthy bear habitat, we have 1 to 2 bears per square mile. So the highest concentration of black bear that we normally get is between 1 and 2 bears per square mile, and we find that in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, actually. So if you ever want to get a chance to see a black bear, that's one of the best places to go. It's relatively untouched, no hunting. The bear population has really grown through the years and gotten nice and dense. Also, the eastern part of the state has a very high bear population, and that's more because of the agricultural areas that we see in the eastern part. The bears are actually eating crops and getting into pig farms and things. So you could see we have a little bit on material cycles that we'll just kind of touch on. And we've been so focused on energy, but let's just go ahead and just touch on material cycles, specifically the hydrologic cycle. So when we're looking at material cycles, guys, we're looking at matter and it's cycling through the ecosystem. Like, for example, the hydrologic cycle, we have the path of water moving through the environment. So what happens in the life of a water molecule? Well, it might start out, say, in the ocean or in the lake. Most water in the world is in the oceans. And so the solar energy strikes the ocean and then begins to provide energy to the water molecule, and it will eventually break out of the liquid state and evaporate and become gaseous water, water vapor. So it evaporates, and then it goes up into the sky where it cools as it goes up in elevation. Then it condenses over land surfaces, turning into clouds. And then after it condenses into cloud, it can form with other water droplets to form precipitation. It falls back down into the ocean or the land, and the cycle repeats. The water cycle, as you can see, is responsible for cellular metabolism, or water is. You see, folks, if you don't have water, you don't have chemical reactions. See, the chemical reactions in your body, they happened when reactants are in the dissolved state. So if you take like solid carbon or solid anything and try to get it to react with something, it doesn't usually happen. You have to dissolve the substance first. Like you would want to dissolve hydrogen chloride and then dissolve the other substance you want to react with. And then you'll start to see reactions. So our reactants, our ingredients in our chemical reactions must be dissolved, then they react. If you ever take a chemistry class, when you do a chemical reaction, you almost always dissolve the substance first in water and then dissolve the other substance in water, and then you combine them together and then the reaction occurs. Nutrient flow in ecosystems. Water is going to carry a lot of nutrients and be responsible for a lot of the flow of nutrients like nitrogen and carbon. And also water is very important in the global distribution of heat. You see, water is very good at storing heat. It's also very good at transferring heat from one area to the next. For example, hurricanes, with all the water they have and all the rain, they're carrying the heat from the tropics up north and helping to distribute the heat more evenly. That's actually the purpose of hurricanes in the world, not just to kill people and cause destruction. They're there to actually create a balance in the world. And so, very neat. And of course, energy is, heat and energy are basically interchangeable, and all that is being transferred by water. A lot of heat is used to make a thunderstorm, and a lot of heat is spread out during a thunderstorm's activity. This is showing you the hydrologic cycle, and you can see all the things happening here. You've got starting off with evaporation from soils, streams, rivers, lakes, going up in the air. A lot of the water is evaporating out of leaves of plants. That's called transpiration. So transpiration is just evaporation out of plants. And then that condenses and you get precipitation over the land, 111,000 cubic kilometers, huge amount of water. And then you see precipitation of the ocean. Once the water lands on a terrestrial environment, it flows. It's called runoff, or it can go down into the ground and become groundwater. It can be locked up in the ground for thousands of years before it finally gets back to the ocean. But you can see this is all, energy is the main driver, the main force. You know, gravity plays a role in moving the water around, but solar energy is really powering the solar system because it evaporates the water, and that gets the water moving around, and that helps the energy to be more distributed across the surface of the earth. All right, folks, we'll hold off on the carbon cycle until we get to class, and I thought we'd just go ahead and end on a short little video clip on, yeah, you guessed it, the water cycle.
All the water on Earth today, every drop, is all the water there has ever been on the planet. Fresh water is actually millions of years old, the same water flowing in a continuous loop, falling as rain and snow from clouds to the Earth's surface, running in rivers, pooling in ponds, flowing from faucets, irrigating crops, traveling through plants, generating power, eventually evaporating into the air and condensing into clouds again.
Why is there life on Earth? And the reason there's life on Earth is because Earth has this perfect water cycle.
The water cycle, so simple even small children understand the basics, yet so complex the most advanced Earth scientists, hydrologists, geologists, and biogeochemists are studying every part and process.
The water cycle is fascinating. It's something that's around us all the time, and yet we don't really understand it.
How to summarize what is known about the water cycle? With two words, flows and stores. The water cycle is a series of flows of water between various water stores or storages. Clouds in the atmosphere.
There's always a little bit of water in the atmosphere. We talk about relative humidity. It's a humid day, it's a dry day. Either way, there's water, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot.
There's a lot of water in the ocean, 70% of all the water on Earth. In the ice sheets and glaciers, 2/3 of all the fresh water on Earth. in the snowpacks atop mountains like the Sierra Nevada, in the Great Lakes, in rivers and streams, in reservoirs and watersheds, in wetlands, in the soil, in and on plants and trees rooted in the soil, and beneath the soil, in water tables and underground aquifers like the Ogallala High Plains, which runs underneath parts of 8 states from South Dakota to Texas. All this storage is temporary. Water in all its forms is always in flux and always moving. And there is a name for every kind of movement in the water cycle, starting with precipitation.
Precipitation is the process of water falling onto the surface of the earth. You can have precipitation in many forms: rain, snow, hail.
Rain is falling water in liquid form. Snow, ice, hail, and sleet are falling water in solid or frozen form. Fog and mist, falling water in gas or vapor form. Precipitation that falls directly onto the oceans becomes part of surface ocean and can be churned by wave and wind action into ocean currents. Rain and snow that falls directly on rivers and streams becomes one part of stream flow. Rain that falls onto land takes a different path to the river, as does the snow and ice that falls and collects on mountaintops when temperatures warm.
When snow melts, some of it runs through the snowpack and goes into small streams, tributaries that feed into large rivers.
What about that precipitation that falls on and over land? Some is intercepted by vegetation, plants, and trees.
Like you might imagine someone in the game of football intercepting a pass. These are raindrops trying to come to the ground, and the leaves on the tree intercept them before they hit the ground.
And the precipitation that does hit the ground, it can run off if the ground is hardscape, covered with asphalt or concrete, or if the soil is too wet or saturated to absorb more water, like an over-soaked sponge. Otherwise, precipitation infiltrates the soil surface, percolates into the ground.
Think of it as the water percolating through your coffee grounds in the morning. Gravity continues to pull it downward so it will move through.
Through the topsoil, into spaces between soil and rock particles, down to bedrock and further into fractures, into deep underground aquifers. Even groundwater here is moving sideways or laterally, discharging toward a river, lake, or the sea. Generally, the deeper the flow, the slower the flow.
Some of that fractured water might take a very long time, thousands to millions of years to get out.
And how does water get back out into the atmosphere? It evaporates. It's turned from a liquid into a gas or vapor by the heat of the sun.
If you put a bit of water into a bowl and you set it outside on a sunny day, it's going to disappear. It's still water, it's just in the form of a gas rather than the form of liquid.
Water evaporates from every wet surface, even from wet air. Some rain and snow evaporates into the air while falling. Water evaporates through our respiration and perspiration, and from plants through transpiration. Trans means through or across. Plant roots draw up groundwater.
And plants pull that water up through their stems into their leaves and then release it back out through evapotranspiration.
Evapotranspiration, a spelling bee-worthy term for evaporation from soil and water surfaces plus transpiration from plants. Evaporated water molecules are tiny enough to flow into the air, mix with smoke and dirt particles in the atmosphere, cool, condense into visible masses of water vapor, clouds. Winds move clouds into colder air, water droplets collide and merge, grow bigger and heavier until they are so heavy they fall again, as rain or snow, sleet or hail. Precipitation, collection, runoff, interception, infiltration, percolation, discharge, transpiration, evaporation, condensation. The water cycle.
All right, folks. I think that covered it all pretty well, even a little bit more than what we would have gone into. But that's great from the National Science Foundation. We thank them for that. Folks, if you have any questions for me about anything we've covered in today's online lecture 2C, just go ahead and email me or bring your questions to class, where I'll see you next.